A question I get asked all the time is how to get on your first podcast. And I know that it can feel really overwhelming. It can feel kind of intimidating. You really want to grow your business. You're hearing about how podcasting is like the way to get in front of so many people. I know one of my mentors, he says every week you should try to be on 2 or 3 new podcasts. And I remember hearing that and being like, how? How will I get on these podcasts? And I'm so lucky. I've been growing my business now for a few years. And so I get lots of awesome invitations to be on podcasts. I've got a great network of friends who have podcasts. So it feels like there's no shortage of these opportunities. But I remember a season where it didn't always feel like that. And so I want to share with you the top tips I've got to be able to help you get on your first podcast or your next podcast, and for you to leverage some of the things that I've tried and I've definitely done that have really helped to build not only my community, but helped really grow our business. The first is that you likely do know a podcaster, right? So think about your network. Think about somebody in your life who has a podcast, and even just asking them, hey, I know you've got a podcast. What do you look for in guests? So asking them, I'm looking for more opportunities to be on podcasts. You don't even need to pitch these people, but what are you looking for in a guest? And that can help you, whether that be your podcast pitch page, which you should have one where it outlines kind of those key topics you like to talk about. I always recommend people have like 3 or 4 things that they love to talk about all the time. I love to talk about social, love to talk about podcasting, love to talk about community. I don't really steer away from those. Even sometimes I get asked to be on podcasts and they'll ask me about a topic and they'll say, what about this? And I'm like, can I talk about that? Yes, but it's not really in line with my mission. And so I really try to stick close to that. And so when you are trying to figure out who you want to podcast with, you want to make sure you have an aligned audience. So really thinking about it like, it's not just if you're a business owner, maybe you're a business coach and someone invites you on a dog podcast, probably not an awesome fit, right? I joke around. I was once on a ice cream rating podcast that a friend of mine hosts, and it does quite well. That's not something I really promote because it doesn't really have much to do with my business. So really trying to find those people in your network who have an aligned audience where there's things that you can talk about that's mutually beneficial, where you can showcase your talents, your expertise, and ask them what they're looking for in a guest. And I've been actually surprised where I've been the recipient and I've been the provider of this, where someone said to me, hey, by the way, I'm going to pitch you on my podcast. And I'm like, oh, actually, you don't need a pitch to be on my podcast. I'd love to have you. That's no problem. I'm happy to have you. And I've also had it where people have been like, hey, here's actually the process to get on my podcast. And that's helped really grow our audience as well. So if you're looking to be on a podcast, look around your network and ask your friends, who do you know in your world, in their world, that has a podcast that might be looking for guests? Because that introduction can be like the make or break for getting on podcasts. I'm way more likely to take someone who comes to me by referral of a friend or a colleague than I am to take someone who randomly messages me. So really that one-step referral makes such a big difference. So if you're looking to pitch yourself for a podcast, there's a few things that you should really keep in mind. Firstly, you want to talk about the value that you can add to that audience. So it's not necessarily about you, right? Like it's really about what you can do for the audience. I'll tell you, I get pitches every week, probably a dozen every week. And every week I'm like, that was a crappy pitch. A few things. One, they're not actually talking about my audience. They're talking about what my audience can do for them. They're actually not really in line with the mission of my show. My show is about community. It's about growing your business using community. And then I'll get pitched on something pretty random and it doesn't actually feel aligned, right? It's not actually a good fit for me. And they're not actually saying anything that makes me think that it might be a good fit for me. So when you are pitching people, you want to make sure that you're saying what will resonate with their audience. So what value do you provide? Maybe if the show is about business, you have something or some business acumen that you love to talk about, being able to say, hey, this is something that I love talking about. And I see on your show you've never talked about this before. Or I see you have 3 episodes about this. I have a bit of a different take and I would love, absolutely love to share that with your audience. That is a really huge piece of it. And it is really, really helpful when you start to think about it from their perspective. I'll also tell you there's another hack that I love, and I didn't even write it here in the notes, but something that I love is when people actually listen to my podcast before they pitch. So they come to me and it's not a weird AI generated message, but they're saying to me, hey, I saw this. I loved this about your podcast episode. I listened to this recording with this person. I listened to this recording with that person. Loved it. And when I see that, I'm noticing that they're actually more invested. That's huge, right? That's going to definitely get me to a point where I'm excited and get me to a point where I'm like, wow, there's somebody who is going to add value. They get the gist of my show. They're well prepared. So this isn't just like a huge podcast pitch, like promotion tour. They're actually really trying to get to know me and my audience. And the other piece is that making sure that you have your topics really set up so that they're equipped for for your audience and for a really easy, seamless transition for whatever it is that the host wants to talk about. So if the host is talking about various things, you want to make sure that you're really in it with them and that your topics really resonate with their audience. Another thing is you want to really show up well. Today, I'm in a studio, I have a professional mic, all of those things. It doesn't need to be like that. But a lot of the times, I will tell podcast guests if they come on, and I actually don't think that they're well prepared in terms of background sounds, in terms of mic, in terms of what's kind of going on in their world. That maybe this isn't the right time for us to podcast. You want to make sure that you show up well because you want the podcast host to use the episode. You want to make sure it's something that gets out there. You want them to promote it. You want them to be really, really equipped to use it. So another example is making sure that you're in a quiet space. You want to look professional. You want to make sure that you're dressed appropriately. I would really encourage you to get a mic. We'll link a mic below for you that we love to use. It's the Shure mic. It's awesome. But actually, right now I'm using a $20 Amazon mic. That sounds amazing. So you could also use something like that and it still sounds great. But you want to make sure that you're showing up with a lot of integrity because you want to make sure that it's something that they use. This is something I've seen before, and I've definitely experienced this as a host, where someone's come on and they haven't been their best, right? They're not in their best, mood or even space in their home. Maybe there's a tapping noise, maybe there's a barking, like whatever it looks like. And so really want to make sure that whatever it is, you minimize that so that this way the host is really excited about using your episode. The other piece is how to provide value after. And this is actually where I think most of the magic is made. Because podcasting is not only about the conversation, right? There's so many things afterwards that come. I'm going to tell you so many of my most amazing business relationships have come from really talking with a podcaster, being on a podcast, talking about, whatever it is, us really jamming out, and then inviting them to speak at an event, speaking at their events, making those relationships. And it's been really, really helpful. So a few things I'm going to say is if you go on a podcast and you don't promote it, the host remembers that. And I know that sounds like kind of like a mean thing to say, but it's so true, right? When you go on your first podcast, your second podcast, your 10th podcast, and you don't share the material from the podcast, it does leave a bad taste in their mouth because they're paying likely for a production fee. They're likely, could have interviewed anyone else. There's probably people lining up at their door to be interviewed, and you're not even going to share it in an Instagram story. So I really try whenever I'm on a podcast is if I'm provided assets, I will always post them in my stories. I put it in our weekly newsletter, like really go above and beyond. I talk about it sometimes in Instagram stories. It's a really great way for you to be able to kind of get in front of new people, and people want to see you be on podcasts, right? And that actually helps you with getting on future podcasts. If people see, wow, that person promotes it so well. Look, they're on all these podcasts. That's so great. Then they're going to start to think, wow, that's someone I'm going to need to have on my show. So I've had this before where people have reached out to me because I've been on another show and they see the value that I've provided, but also they've seen me kind of pop up everywhere. That is a great opportunity for you to be building audience and building community, which is the whole point of the podcast, right? You can even take that a step further. Sometimes I like to invite my guests when I have the capacity to do like an Instagram live that week when the podcast comes out. So my audience can get even more acquainted with who they are, and I get to borrow their audience and get to know them. So really, you want to be able to provide value. There's also nothing wrong with after your podcast has aired and you've promoted it and you feel good about it, being like, hey, I had such a great conversation with you last week. And I'm wondering if, you have any other friends who you think would benefit from having me on their podcast. If someone feels like you've done such a great job promoting and you have been such an advocate for their podcast, of course they're going to share you with their friends. I have no problem when people ask me about this. We have a podcast agency with over 35 clients. And I often introduce people to my clients because I want my clients to have great guests. And I know that they're going to move the needle for their show. So that is a really important way for you to think about being able to provide value. The last piece is that, okay, say you have been in a situation where you cannot find anyone you know who has a podcast, which I'm going to tell you, you probably have to look a little harder. But if you don't want to start your own podcast, which honestly is the greatest hack on getting on podcasts, is having a podcast because people are really open to kind of those swaps, right? But if you are really like in a pickle and you can't find that way to get rolling, there's two things that I love. Firstly is Podmatch. Podmatch is a great website where it's free and you're able to just get on there, make a profile for yourself, and be able to like pitch yourself to lots of podcasts. And I've actually taken people on there when I was looking for different types of guests, and people who I've built really great relationships with, who I've taught in their communities. There's so many people out there. So really building that. And then there's another one that's called Find a Guest, Be a Guest. It's a Facebook group. I will tell you, if you post in there, you will be inundated with podcast opportunities. Again, you want it to be aligned. You want to make sure that they're people that you would feel really excited about not only being on their podcast, but being in their world, really being connected with them. But those are two really great ways for you to be able to get on podcasts if you've never done it before. But don't be afraid to pitch people. People want to pitch, but just make it an authentic one. And really, if I'm going to tell you anything, like being on podcasts is like one of the greatest networking hacks out there, right? You get to meet people, you get to have really intimate conversations, you get to really talk about what you do, how you do it, and why it's important. That is huge, right? That is a huge opportunity with people that you've never seen before or you don't know. And I love guesting on podcasts. And that's what I started doing before I had my podcast. It actually also helped me become more confident as a podcaster. Being on the first few podcasts I was on helped me be a better interviewer. It showed me what I loved, showed me what I didn't like. And now I feel really confident to get behind the mic and really talk to anybody. So I would say, podcasting is such an amazing hack. If you're listening to this, it's because you're already interested in being on a podcast. So I don't need to sell you on why you need it. But I'd recommend you really just giving it a shot, trying to get in front of somebody and trying to really just get started, over deliver for them. I can't wait to hear you on whatever podcast you end up on next.